So speaking of the Kardashians of Bitcoin and those who we can't quite tell what they're doing in this business, I really have no idea what Coinlab does. I'm sure this is not going to make me popular in certain circles, but I have no idea what they do. I know that they tried to build a partnership with Mt.Gox, but what we're finding out recently is that in the process, they ran off with 5 million. Well, interesting stuff.
The story we're talking about here is this ongoing dispute between Coinlab and Mt.Gox. They originally signed an agreement back in, I think it was November of last year, where Coinlab was going to become Mt.Gox's essentially agent in the United States. They were going to handle regulatory compliance, and in exchange for that, they were going to get an exclusive license to North America for all of Mt.Gox's customers. All of Mt.Gox's customers were supposed to become Coinlab customers, and there was a revenue split that went back and forth. When we first saw the terms of the contract, when this became public, I think it was in might have been May. I don't recall. Anyways, earlier this year, back in Q1 or Q2, we found out about this. And a lot of people identified this contract as being kind of predatory on the side of Coinlab because there were a lot of gotchas in there for Mt.Gox, where if something went wrong, then they lost a lot of money. It was going to cost them a lot of money. And so when Coinlab sued them for breach of contract, that's kind of what we thought it was. Now, a couple of months have passed and Mt.Gox has filed its response. And in that response, they essentially say that the contract is null and void because Coinlab didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. And their end of the bargain was compliance as specified by the law by a certain date. But there is a twist to this. Andreas, did you see the twist, the 6-day difference?
Yes, there was a slight difference in the end of the contract and the date for coming into compliance, which essentially in this case means getting state licenses. And the key here was that literally days before the end of the compliance deadline, FinCEN comes out and in their memorandum says that pretty much anybody who does this has to be a money transmitter. So literally days before the end of this obligation, suddenly this obligation becomes a 47 state licensing obligation.
So days before, when they were compliant going up to that point, so 7 days before this contract came due, they were actually in compliance with it. But then, one more day passes and this new guidance comes out and suddenly they're not only not in compliance, but they're screwed because there's no chance that they can ever be in compliance in the amount of time that they have left.
So one key lesson here is never sign a contract in Bitcoin that says that you will remain in compliance because you cannot remain in compliance. There is a government here that is going to try to make sure that you are never in compliance. They'll keep moving the goalposts. So, that's a key lesson here. They were in compliance up to days before, right?
Is it possible to do this type of business, to have these this wasn't even a long-term agreement. This was a 6-month contract and they couldn't even hold that up. This is the thing, getting back to the topic we hit on previously about the entrepreneurs. This is exactly why they're so gung-ho for regulation, because regulation, whether it's good or whether it's bad, at least there will be rules then, and the rules won't be expected to change on a kind of ad hoc basis.
I don't know, but they could still change.
Oh, they'll change on a very ad hoc basis. Absolutely.
But
I don't think
what's the point?
Regulation. Yeah, what's the point?
No, seriously, what's the point of having regulations if they can change at any time? Because that means you can't make plans for the future because you might be wrong. And then not only are you wrong, but you've allocated resources incorrectly.
Right, which only matters if you're not part of the guild, and therefore those regulations will be used against you in a court of law. If you're part of the guild, then none of the regulations really apply because, oh my, we didn't know, we couldn't tell, it was just that guy, the big whale, the derivatives, it was AIG's fault, who knows?
Well, that's a great question that you asked, Adam, because indeed, what's the point? I can't answer that question, which is why...
wait, consumer protection. No, sorry, never mind, not that one.
Right, which is why I don't understand the push for regulation, because they are going to change. There's not going to be the certainty that people are looking for. They're not going to get their need for certainty and clarity and predictability met by getting regulations. So why don't they just try to roll with whatever's going on right now?
I take a utilitarian approach, which is if these regulations actually protected consumers, I'd be very much in favor of having at least a modicum of rules that are clear and easy to understand. But really, that's more of having a rule of law and contracts in place so you can figure out what's going on. The problem is this has nothing to do with consumer protection, right? At the end of the day, none of these regulations really protect us. And we've seen this in practice again and again.
So then it becomes about getting inside the guild, like you just said, so that you're immune from having any of these enforced on you. And that's the subtext here. So many of these businesses, I think they do want to be part of the guild, and they want to get on the good side of the regulators so that they won't have these used against them.
We had a really good interview with one of the representatives of money transmitting associations. If I remember correctly, his main argument was you can't comply because they're going to change the rules. As soon as you try to comply, they're going to shift the goalposts. I think the lesson there was that even the money transmitters, those who have the coveted licenses, are second-class citizens in the financial industry and are being hounded, their banks being shut down, their licensing being discriminated against. So it's all, the same problem. What they're facing is exactly what Bitcoin will face. And the lesson there, the warning, the cautious warning was, don't try to change the regulation. You'll never be compliant.
Okay, then let's talk about the consumer protection aspect of it for a second, because there is actually a change coming up. I believe towards the end of October, we have a change coming with the implementation of the consumer portion of the Dodd-Frank rules here in the States. Those Dodd-Frank rules, notably, are going to require that anyone who is a money transmitter, which again means any sort of Bitcoin exchange, has to provide a 30-minute price guarantee and refund period for anyone who's making a purchase with them or trying to send money with them. We've talked about this in the past briefly, but again, with something like that, where we're talking about consumer protections, it's a different question because that sort of breaks Bitcoin to a certain extent. But I'm asking more about the consumer protection side. Is there any consumer protection that you think would actually be applicable?
I think the most effective and powerful consumer protection laws are those that involve transparency. If the consumer is able to be well informed about the transaction, I think that helps. And certainly the laws that apply there help. Breaking Bitcoin to make it more consumer friendly, I would say no to that. If the regulation comes through and it says, people need to be able to do refunds or people need to be able to do chargebacks, then what that's going to do is it's going to force those who are in that part of the business to simulate that. And the way they're going to simulate that is by doing a lot of know your customer and anti-money laundering and taking your identity, doing a lot of credit checks, and then putting a lot of limits on your transactions in order to be able to essentially offer insurance, refund insurance.
Okay, so I'm going to pivot this question again. There's an ATM that has come out called Robocoin, right? And there are going to be these in Canada. There'll be units in, I believe, the United States. I'm not exactly clear on where. And rather than try and position themselves as a vending machine, as we've seen Lamasu do, where they don't have to necessarily have all of the KYC requirements, they have gone full bore into it. In order to make a purchase with this, you use cash and put it in just like you do with the Lamasu machine. But in order to make a purchase, you need to put in your government issued ID. Then you need to have your face scanned, and then you need to have your palm print scanned. And then that information, you haven't seen this before? You haven't seen this yet? Yeah, this information is associated with the purchase that you've made. So I've been sending emails to the various people correspond with on the legal side of things and saying, okay, so if Bitcoin is really, really, really difficult forensically to try and follow the money on, but you have these points of entry where you can definitively tie identity with all these, verifying factors to one person, then what's to stop a law enforcement agent from, say, 40 transactions after it's left your hands, somebody does something illegal with it? What's to stop them from tracing it back?
Adam.
Yeah, right, exactly.
His thumbprints on it.
It's not even about blaming the purchaser. It's about identifying the purchaser as the easiest point to start the investigation, which then means if you use one of these to purchase, then you could have a knock on your door or somebody, calling you up and saying, hey, where did you spend this? And then they go from you to the next person you spent it with until they eventually find the person. If we lived in a world where you had a right to privacy, unless you actually committed crime yourself, then it might not be a concern. But that doesn't really seem to be the world we live in right now. So what do you guys think of that sort of move with these ATMs?
Yeah, it's concerning. I wouldn't use one. But then again, it's getting more difficult to get Bitcoins anonymously. Even if you're going on local Bitcoins or you're buying them from your friend or whatever, somebody along that chain somewhere has their identity potentially tied to those Bitcoins, right? Mining's a way to get them somewhat anonymously, but it's getting harder and harder. And so, maybe we'll see a big price premium for Bitcoins that are bought in such a way that you don't have to tie your identity to it. And then the market's speaking, and then it's just an artificial distortion that's imposed by all these requirements that you identify yourself to get Bitcoins.
Or maybe we can learn from the past and look at how government has behaved when placed next to a large trove of data. Their little eye gleams, they take their little grubby fingers and they reach across and they take all the data and they stick it in their pockets because they're greedy little. So the bottom line is that we're going to have to build Bitcoin in such a way that all of the clients basically do anonymizing mixing when you buy a Mars bar. And they do it again when you buy some gum from the store, and when you buy a soda, and when you buy a car, and when you buy $1 billion worth of drugs. And at every step in between, every single transaction should be anonymized. And at the end of the day, that's going to deny the opportunity for people to do these kinds of things.
Won't that hugely add to the blockchain? I mean, like if for every transaction you have to do, 20 other transactions have to occur because you have to mix. Then
actually, no, not at all. In fact, and this is, I think, a very interesting project that's come up. You can look at things like CoinJoin. I'm going to be doing an interview on that topic. And in that case, what you're doing is you're simply grouping transactions together in such a way that obfuscates the origins and destinations. But if you do that systematically across the whole network, it makes it damn hard to figure anything out.
So basically, as we have more identity associated with the points of entry, we need better obfuscation throughout the actual process. We need better mixing and we need more certain. So, okay, that's interesting. I'll buy that. So what do you think about the idea of using physical Bitcoins more? Because again, we've talked about this in the past. The only actual anonymous way to transact Bitcoins is to use physical Bitcoins, because with physical Bitcoins, you're not actually making a transaction on the network. You're actually giving someone a wallet known to contain a set amount of Bitcoin that can be redeemed one time by one person, but before it's redeemed can change hands and is completely anonymous, just like real cash is in person. And of course, it has the liabilities of cash too.
I think the threshold is so high that people will use real cash instead for a very long time before that happens. It's definitely the destination where we're going. In the meantime, we have to make the network into a darknet by default.
Okay, so this has been like the most long and rambly topic I think we've ever done, but I actually do want to ask a question about that. I have spent some time on the Onion, on the darknet that we have now. I've investigated I2P, and I have a basic understanding of how these things work. To my experience, they're pretty slow and they don't actually work that well. So does a system like that have a chance of scaling? I mean, we talked about this on an earlier episode, how, because the NSA has really breached the social agreement that they had with the cryptography community and the internet community, your contention, Andreas, is that we're going to have the internet become a darknet of darknets over the next 10 or 15 years. But is that usable?
Yeah, absolutely, it's usable. Once you do it at scale, the network effect ensures that you're not too many hops away from someone who has the right data in the right encrypted format that you can use. So yeah, it's slow when you have few entry and exit nodes, slow when the network doesn't propagate very fast. But at the end of the day, if you do have such a overhead issue, let's say that the network is 20% slower if it's a darknet to start with, equivalent network. Well, with Moore's law, you'd have to wait about 2 years before, from a network basis, you've eaten up that overhead. And now you're sitting on a darknet that has the equivalent functionality but is dark. I think eventually that's where we're going.
This is where we say, thank goodness for the idealists.
Hi, this is Jason King, founder at Sean's Outpost, and you are listening to Let's Talk Bitcoin. Sean's Outpost is a homeless outreach in Pensacola, Florida, and we are proudly powered by Bitcoin. To date, over 13,000 meals have been fed to the homeless in our area, all purchased with Bitcoin and through the generosity of the cryptocurrency community. Read more about us at seansoutpost.com. Food, shelter, Bitcoin, everybody. Sean'sOutpost.com.